You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
This is not a property that we can easily sell because it's not based on something that people already know. That's why you're seeing so many films based on comic books, based on video games, based on board games, based on toys. And part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that unlike the 70s when Dan kind of came up, studios are no longer being run by creatives. They're being run by business people. You have people that are not coming out of USC or UCLA Film School or NYU Film School running things. You have people instead who are coming out of Wharton. You have people that are coming out of the Harvard Business School.
Hey everyone, thanks again for hitting that play button. This is episode 93 of the Dave Bullis Podcast. Just some show notes before we get into the podcast episode. The 2016 Oscars were announced, and as usual, with the Oscar noms, there's no controversy at all. With everyone protesting, and saying Oscars so white, John Singleton, who is an African-American director, he directed Boys in the Hood, he has a great rebuttal to all this, which I will link to in the show notes. And I think he really puts things into perspective. I also was a little shocked that there was no love for Trumbo. I know Bryan Cranston got the Best Actor nomination, but I'm a little surprised that they didn't get at least nominated for Best Writing as well. And I'll also be making a blog post over at davebullis.com about all my picks for best movies of the year. I'll put that post up in a little bit, maybe a few weeks. There's a few left I have to see. I want to say thank you to everyone who shared the last podcast, which was episode 92 with Ron Peters. It actually has the most shares of any podcast episode I've ever done. That episode alone has over 1,000 shares. So thank you very much. And again, everyone, I hate to keep reiterating this, but the more you share the podcast, the more it helps me out, it helps the guest out. So even if you find one thing helpful in the podcast, one sentence, one idea, what have you, really appreciate it if you would share it. So on this episode, I have Matt R Lohr. He actually co-wrote a book with Dan O'Bannon called The Dan O'Bannon Guide to Screenplay Structure. And Dan O'Bannon was one of my favorite screenwriters ever, and I recommend the book highly as it's written by a true master of the craft because Dan didn't just talk about the craft. He actually wrote Alien, he wrote Total Recall, he wrote Life Force, he wrote Return of the Living Dead. I mean, the man was a genius. So I get to talk with a man who was his apprentice, and he actually helped co-write his book. Unfortunately, Dan passed away a few years ago, so just hearing Matt's stories about Dan are just truly phenomenal. So without further ado, here we go, episode 93 with Matt R Lohr.
You're listening to the Dave Bullis Podcast.
Hey everyone, thanks again for joining me for another episode of the Dave Bullis Podcast. Joining me today is Matt R Lohr. Matt is an award-winning screenwriter, essayist, and critic. He holds an MFA in screenwriting from Chapman University and is a co-author of the book, The Dan O'Bannon Guide to Screenplay Structure. Matt, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here.
Matt, like I was saying to you before the podcast started, I am a huge fan of Dan O'Bannon, and, it was so great to be able to get you to come on to the show because, you can sort of, give us a look into the book that, others wouldn't be able to have. And I didn't mean to make that rhyme, by the way. So could you, sort of take us through, how you actually met Dan and how you ended up sort of writing a book with him?
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned in my introduction that I attended Chapman University, which is in Orange County, California. If you follow the Hollywood Reporter rankings every year, it's consistently ranked as one of the top 10 film schools in the world. And I was there as a master's student studying screenwriting at the beginning of the century. God, that makes me sound old. And one of the things that the school does every year is they have a filmmaker in residence every year. And they have a filmmaker come in and teach master classes. And they do sort of retrospective screenings of his or her films. My second year in the 2-year program, our filmmaker in residence was Dan O'Bannon. Oddly enough, I wasn't actually taking his class. I was deeply immersed at the time in my thesis writing for my thesis screenplay. And my instructor for that was Leonard Schrader. Some of you might know him as the brother of Paul Schrader, who's the writer of Taxi Driver and Raging Bull. And Leonard's was a pretty impressive screenwriter in his own right, probably best known for Kiss of the Spider Woman, which he was nominated for an Academy Award for in 1985. Leonard was my thesis advisor. And one day, about 2 weeks into our second year of the school, he came to our class and said, some of you might know Dan O'Bannon. He's our filmmaker in residence. He's writing a book on screenwriting, and he's hoping to maybe talk to a graduate student about possibly helping him out with the book. And my entire class came to me basically one at a time and said, Matt, this is a perfect fit for you. You got to do this. So Leonard worked on putting me in touch, and I talked to Dan. And at the time, it was difficult because I was living in Orange County. Dan lived in a fairly well-off suburb up in north of LA called Pacific Palisades. And I had no car at the time. So whenever I went to see him, I actually had to rent a car for the day to drive up to Pacific Palisades to work with him. And we got together. The first time I got to his house, he was just finishing up lunch. And we talked for about 3 minutes. And Dan kind of looked at me and said, Matt, let me ask you something. Have you ever taken any psychedelic drugs? And and I said, no, I can't say that I have. And he kind of eyeballed me and he said, I didn't think so. You look like Clark Kent. And that was my introduction to the world of Dan O'Bannon. But it was a good fit, believe it or not, after that. And we worked together on the book, intimately together, for about 2 years. And unfortunately, after that, those of you who know Dan's personal history and know his past know that he's sort of suffered from some chronic health issues throughout his life. He had Crohn's disease, which is a digestive and intestinal disorder, and battled it intermittently on and off throughout a large period of his life. The last few years, he had taken a turn for the worse. The last time I actually saw him, I think, was in 2007. And he was not looking really very well at that point. He passed away 2 years after that, in late 2009. The book still hadn't been published yet at that point. It was still, as far as I knew, a work in progress. And about a year and a half later, Dan's wife, Diane, who I'd become friendly with during the course of working on the book, approached me and said, Michael Weesey Productions, who published Save the Cat and The Writer's Journey and tons of really well-known screenwriting books, are interested in publishing Dan's book. But the manuscript is not 100% ready to go, and they need somebody to take it on, do some polishing, tighten up some sections, and sort of finish things up. You knew Dan better than anybody on this book. You worked with him for 2 years. Can you do this? So I spent about another year sort of finalizing the manuscript, and that's the book that came out and is in stores now.
The book is absolutely phenomenal.
Thank you.
Because one of the reasons is that it's so great, Matt, is it hits a sweet spot that other screenwriting books don't. And what I mean by that is that Dan not only was an accomplished screenwriter who actually went out and did what he was talking about, but he also knows how to actually teach it, if you know what I mean. And it's such a rare ability to get into that sort of middle ground where, you're not so advanced that you can't really help anybody out. And then the other end of that spectrum is you've never done anything. So you just, you teach a lot about it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Dan, that was one of the things that helped our book is that, a lot of screenwriting gurus say this works. Dan was able to say this works. And here are the mega hit classic movies that prove it, that I wrote with this system. At the time, there wasn't really a lot of, people that had really done big scripts like that. There's I'd say only two that I can think of. There was William Goldman with Adventures in the Screen Trade. And then after the publication of Dan's book, or shortly before, you had Writing Movies for Fun and Profit, which was Robert Bangarant and Thomas Lennon's book, which is also available. But I think that Dan's, I'd say Goldman also, obviously has a great reputation. And Dan is lucky enough to have some movies that are classics. I actually thought about that this week when the Oscar nominations came out. And Ridley Scott had a movie that's in the running for Best Picture. And I thought, Ridley might not be there if it wasn't for Alien working. And one of the reasons that Alien worked as well as it did is because Dan ripped that character out of his subconscious and helped bring it to life. And I think that it's interesting to me, one of the things that I've experienced just working on the book and promoting it and going to appearances and events and things like that, just the people that really love writing and really love film know Dan and know his work and know what a contribution he made. It's interesting. Just a lot of times I can tell who the real writers are and who the real film people are when I tell them that I worked with Dan O'Bannon and I don't have to explain to them who that is. And his reputation sort of precedes him. That's one of the reasons why we kept the title of the book as simple as we did, because the selling point is this is Screenplay Structure according to Dan O'Bannon. And the subtitle mentions Alien and Total Recall and The Return of the Living Dead, which of course he also directed.
One of the things about Dan was he was able to go to all these different genres. And, I was actually watching the Canon Films documentary about a week ago, and they actually brought up Life Force, which Dan wrote. And because people were actually, the one knock on the film that some people were, even in the documentary, were saying was
not enough nudity.
Yeah, exactly. That's one. They were saying that it was so many different things. Some people said, well, they couldn't get a grasp on it, because, it starts off in space, then it becomes sort of a vampire movie, and then it becomes something totally different by the end. But you know what? I actually think it works because, with the way Alien, I actually listened to Alien with Dan's commentary on it, and he actually went through all the different things. And, he said, for instance, when they were landing to find that distress beacon, and they went out and they started to land, and it wasn't a smooth landing. There was a fire broke out, and he said, I've always wanted to see that one, that time where nothing goes as smoothly as it's supposed to. Even the landing gets screwed up.
Yeah. And
it's just like details like that. But the reason I bring up Life Force is, to be honest, I think if that was even released today, or if even a moviegoer, found that today, because I do have it in my stash here. But if a person who's never even maybe heard of Dan, like a film student or a high school senior, that movie I think would work better today than it even did then. Because a lot, I find that sometimes it actually works. Is that some of their works, like Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, when it got released, it didn't really find an audience, but it's gained this cult following over the years.
Yeah.
And even like Revenge of the Living Dead, because when I was a kid watching that, I was so used to Romero.
Yeah.
So when I saw that as a kid, I was like, wait, zombies talk now? Did I miss something?
Yeah, zombies talk, and the brain thing specifically. is from Dan. I mean, zombies always ate human flesh, but Dan specifically, because remember at one point, one of the talking zombies, somebody asked her, "Why do you eat people?" And she says, "Not people, brains." And that comes. So whenever you see a zombie going brains, you can thank Dan O'Bannon for that. It's interesting that you bring up Life Force. I remember reading an interview with Dan years ago, before I even met him, where he talked about Life Force, and he said that book that was based on was called Space Vampires. That movie should have been called Space Vampires. He always felt that was more in the comment that he made was, we had this kind of crazy, wild science fiction movie, and the studio tried to sell it as 2001. And that was one of the reasons why it somewhat didn't connect commercially, because, and you still see this a lot of times in movies now, where they're selling the film as something the film is not. They're selling the movie they wanted you to have made rather than the movie you actually made. And I think that if they had gone a little more outrageous with some of the marketing, I think the movie might have found the audience that it enjoys now as sort of a cult audience. I think it was Scream Factory that put out the Blu-ray of that recently. They did a really great job. It's got great extras. The movie looks great. And I think I've talked to Diane, Dan's wife, about that movie. We're both fans. We both think it's among sort of Dan's maybe unfairly underrated works. We're Life Force boosters in Camp Dan O'Bannon.
So, Matt, speaking of that, what is your favorite Dan O'Bannon movie?
When I was getting ready to, start promoting the book, I said, I got to revisit all of these because who knows what I'm going to get asked about. And, I sat down and I had a chance to watch all of them again. And there's just something, I know it's probably an answer a lot of people give, and it's sort of a cliche answer. There is just something about Alien. I always admire a film that's trying to scare you and that's trying to show you spectacular things that stands the test of time. And Alien was made in 1979. I was a year old when Alien came out. And you watch it now, and the scares still work. It's got visual effects that even in 2016, I don't feel like you have to make apologies for or allowances for. I think it's just really, it's so efficiently effective in terms of what it does. And you talked about the idea of sort of mixing genres. The thing I love about Alien that it does so beautifully is that it basically sort of splits down the middle in terms of what its genre is. You have this first hour that is a science fiction movie, and science fiction is about curiosity about the unknown. And they're trying to find out what this thing is and find out where it comes from and what it means for them in terms of good or ill. But as soon as that thing bursts out of John Hurt's chest, all of a sudden, we're not in a science fiction movie anymore. We're in a horror movie, which is about fear of the unknown. They don't care what it is or where it came from or what its government is like. They just want to get away from it or kill it. And it transitions so dramatically, it almost could split the movie down the middle as much as it splits John Hurt down the middle. But I feel like they're so beautifully of a piece. I think a lot of credit for that does go to Ridley. I think he does a really beautiful job sort of sustaining the feel of it throughout. It's got a great vibe and a great mood, and that's to his credit. I think in the hands of a lesser director, the split might have been too drastic and the movie might not have survived it.
I concur. And especially with, Ridley now, when he revisited The Engineer, because The Engineer, what we saw in Alien, it was pretty big. I remember them going on, right by it, and, The Engineers and Prometheus were, although they were still big, they were a tad bit smaller.
Yeah.
And again, I was, when I saw the commercial for Prometheus and I actually saw that mask, I was like, oh my God, if they just connect those two, that would be amazing. Because being able to see what happens. But then I actually enjoyed Prometheus. I know I'm in the minority with that because I kind of had a feeling going in. I said, you know what? What if they just stretch this out into its own trilogy? And then, you know what I mean? And then, and then at the end, spoiler alert, everybody, I'm pretty much sure everyone's seen it by now, but they end up, it's a cliffhanger ending and they're going to, now Prometheus 2 is coming out soon. And it's 10 years later. So, that was, actually, you know what, Matt, I want to ask you, did you get the chance to see Prometheus?
I did. If you go to the Michael Wiese Productions website, which is the website of the production company, or published the book, Diane and I actually do a video presentation where we talk in fairly extensive detail about sort of comparing and contrasting Alien with Prometheus. I think for me, the failures of Prometheus, I think there's great things in it, but I don't think it's an entirely successful film. I think the failure for me are more failures of character than of story. I feel like one of the things that I love about Alien is you're with a crew of people that have been with each other for a while. And I think Ridley establishes that really well, and Dan establishes that really well in the writing and the direction. I always cite that first scene where we see them eating together right after they've gotten out of their hypersleep chambers. And there's just such a natural, easy, unforced camaraderie between them. Ridley kind of just shoots it sort of hanging back on the wall, watching. It almost feels like something out of a Robert Altman movie. And I just feel like you invest in them so thoroughly because they bring you into that atmosphere and into that camaraderie. With Prometheus, we're dealing with a lot of people that have never met each other, that don't really know each other. They don't know what their intentions are. And I feel like that lack of sort of connection between the people in the crew sort of hampers the ability for the movie to maybe to have the emotional impact it might otherwise have had.
And one other thing too in Prometheus was, they had a scene similar to that where the crew was all sort of hanging out. Now in Prometheus, they showed us that the crew really didn't know each other too well.
Right, exactly.
And the one character who always gets beat over the head is that character Fiefeld. And because, he's sort of the Irish stoner who's also, I think he's a PhD in something with animal studies. But, basically he said, I'm just in this for the money. And a lot of criticism was basically they tried to take that same conversation from Alien and make it into Prometheus.
Yeah.
But the reason why it doesn't work, and even I agree, even though I like Prometheus, as I said, the one reason it doesn't work is because one, you figure these people would meet each other before this because this is a very expensive trip.
Yeah.
Like that's made clear from the start. And in Alien, they're a bunch of miners, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like, the blue collar, men and women, and they're just like, look, we're just getting home with this haul of, I think ore is what they had, or some kind of minerals.
Yeah.
And
Dan described them as truckers in space was the kind of atmosphere he wanted.
Yeah, it feels that way. Cause like you just said, they feel like they were a team, but with Prometheus, you just sort of feel like it was almost like they just threw everyone together at the last minute and said, hey, we're going to space now.
Yeah, exactly. And whether or not you actually have chemistry and connect as a crew is of secondary concern to us. That's something you want to throw that kind of money behind, obviously.
Matt, one of the other things, in the book, in the prefix, which, you actually did an intro for, I have to ask, you got a private showing of Revenge of the Living Dead with Dan, Return of the Living Dead. I'm sorry, Return of the Living Dead with Dan. And you actually get to sit down with him and watch it. What was that like to actually sit down there and watch a movie like that with him?
Well, I didn't know that was going to happen. I went over there. We were going to be working on the book. I think they were living in Culver City at that point, or Mar Vista. And I dropped by the house. We were planning to get together for a regular work session. And at the time, I believe it was MGM was getting ready to put out. It was an anniversary edition. I can't remember what anniversary. It might have been 25th. And they were getting ready to put out a 25th anniversary edition of Return of the Living Dead on DVD. Because I don't think Blu-ray was even a thing yet at that point, which shows you how old I am, once again. And they sent over a VHS copy of the movie to show you how old we all are now, to basically for Dan to check the color correction, to make sure the color looked right. And he just said to me, let's look at some of this, and let me know if the color looks all right. And we basically sat and watched the whole movie. And Dan more or less did sort of an ongoing, it was like getting basically a live director's commentary. And Dan told me about, how they did some of the special effects and about different problems they had with locations and this and that. And it was just it was one of the most hands-on sort of direct learning experiences I had. And it was such a great insight into Dan's mind. Because one of the things I always tell people is people always ask me, well, what's the main thing that Dan taught you about screenwriting? And I would say, well, Dan didn't really teach me anything because I wasn't there to be taught by him. I was there to enable his book to help him to teach others. But I always feel like I learned so much just being in Dan's presence and talking story with Dan and breaking down scripts with Dan. I always say I almost learned like it was like osmosis. I almost just absorbed these things through the natural interaction of putting the book together. And it was, sort of a sitting at the feet of the master kind of experience for me. And it's something I'll never be able to replicate in my life. And it's something really, it means a lot. It just means a lot that there was, I thought about it one day, and I thought about people like Ron Chissette, with whom Dan wrote Total Recall. They share credit on Total Recall. And I thought about Don Jacoby, who he wrote Blue Thunder with. And I'm part of that group now. I'm part of the group of Dan O'Bannon writing collaborators. And it's very humbling to be in that kind of company.
Yeah, it definitely is. And, Total Recall is a movie. I don't know why. I enjoy it a lot, and I always forget that Dan wrote it. Yeah. And I know with Alien, I know Life Force, but every time I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, Dan O'Bannon wrote that. But once I go back to it, Matt, I always come back and I'm like, this feels like a Dan O'Bannon movie.
Yeah.
Because it starts off a certain way and then it goes off another way. And personally, by the way, just to note about that writing style, I think that I actually find that to be fascinating, but I think it does well for stories too. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
Oh, no problem. No, one of the things I do think that people can find in Total Recall, and I think this is probably why he may have sort of connected with Paul Verhoeven in some respects, is Dan had a real wicked sense of humor. Anybody that's seen Return of the Living Dead knows that. And I do think that wicked sense of humor from Dan comes through in Total Recall. There's one moment in the movie, because I read Dan's original draft of Total Recall from 1982. Diane gave me a copy of it that I read. And I can tell you very specifically one line that I absolutely know originates with Dan, because it's not in the original story and it's in Dan's script, is the scene when the Schwarzenegger character, Quaid, confronts his wife, who's actually this spy character, and he asks her something and she says, I don't know, I just work here. That's Dan. And I had a chance a couple of years ago, shortly before the book came out, the Egyptian Theater, which is a great repertory theater on Hollywood Boulevard here in LA, showed Total Recall. They had a 70 millimeter archive print of it from the Sony archives. And they showed the film, and Paul Verhoeven and the two surviving screenwriters, Ron Chissette and Gary Goldman, were there and did a Q&A after the film. And it was wonderful to be in a packed house of people and see that movie, which at that point was over, now it's going on, I think, God, it's 25 years old, almost 26 years old. And that movie still plays with an audience. The laughs still land. The thrills are still there. And it was just really exciting to be in that group. And I will say that once I opened it up to the crowd for questions, I was very happy that one of the first questions that got asked was somebody in the audience asked for them to expound a little on Dan's contributions to the script. Because he was, of course, the only writer who wasn't there, unfortunately, to speak for himself.
Yeah, and that is good. Someone actually, brought that up. One thing about, Total Recall was, well, not about the particular Total Recall, but they actually remade it a few years ago. And I was completely, I was kind of, confused. I mean, I know right now, there's a certain model that Hollywood works with. If it's not a comic book movie, it already has to be a, established property,
right,
like, a remake of a TV show, or in this case, a previous movie. So, when the Total Recall remake came out, I was curious. I did check it out, and it is in no way as good as the original. I don't know if you had a chance to check out the remake.
I did see it. I think it's not bad for what it is. To expound a little bit on what you were just talking about, there's a term that you and your audience, when you dig sort of into the industry side of things, are going to come across being used a lot. It's a very common term now, and that term in the industry is pre-sale value. A lot of times you'll hear about people having their scripts rejected by producers or studios because they're told this is a very good piece of work, but it has no pre-sale value. What that essentially means is this is not a property that we can easily sell because it's not based on something that people already know. That's why you're seeing so many films based on comic books, based on video games, based on board games, based on toys. And part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that unlike the 70s when Dan kind of came up, studios are no longer being run by creatives. They're being run by business people. You have people that are not coming out of USC or UCLA Film School or NYU Film School running things. You have people instead who are coming out of Wharton. You have people that are coming out of the Harvard Business School who are running these kinds of organizations. And because of that, their instincts a lot of times are not to create, but to repackage something that already worked and try to resell it to you as something new. And I think Dan mentions in the book, I want to say the comparison he makes, if I remember correctly, is, you might have a great, fantastic original script with something fresh and innovative and new that nobody's ever seen before. And then this other guy over here wrote a movie based on Chips Ahoy cookies. And people have heard of Chips Ahoy cookies. So that's going to have a lot easier time to try to get made. I remember reading stories in the trades for a few years that one of the studios was trying to get a Stretch Armstrong movie made. I don't know if you remember Stretch Armstrong.
Oh, yeah, I remember Stretch
Armstrong.
Little
plastic, his arms stretch out. the end. That's the whole story. And they were like fighting for 3 years to try to get a Stretch Armstrong movie off the ground because people have heard of Stretch Armstrong. So, it's not as if the world needed a fresh take on Total Recall. It's not as if there was a burning desire. And I'll say this, watching the movie again a few years ago, the special effects again still hold up. Those are two Dan movies, Alien and Total Recall, both of which won Academy Awards for special effects. And in both cases, I think the effects in both of those films hold up. So it's not like you needed to update the technology to make it work. It's simply a question of there are a lot of people out there who won't watch a movie that's set in 1990 or that was made in 1990. That's an old movie to them. So if you can give them the same, that's why we're seeing remakes of Friday the 13th, and Texas Chainsaw Horror is also, doing a lot of that as well. And it's because a lot of those audiences for those movies skew young, but they won't watch movies that they perceive to be old, which would be a movie from 1990. And Friday the 13th is even older than that. So I do think that has a lot to do with it as well. I don't know if it's necessarily a dearth of creativity. It's easier to sell something that audiences are already familiar with.
Yeah, one of the things I've always seen now is the superhero movies, the graphic novels, and I can understand too, because I remember reading an article a couple years ago when Edgar Wright's I can't believe I'm blanking on this movie. Let me just take a quick look at whatever this movie's called.
Was this Ant-Man?
No, it was Scott.
Oh, Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
Yes, Scott Pilgrim versus the World. Thank you. A couple years ago when I read an article about Edgar Wright's Scott Pilgrim versus the World, and it didn't do so well in the box office.
No.
And the writer said, this is why whenever something like this happens, the president of the studio can point at and say, aha, you see, this is why everything has to be a pre-existing property. This is why we go with the superhero movies. This is why we go with the comic book movies. This is why we do remakes. And, just going it through that sort of point of view, I did understand it a little bit better as to why certain things are the way they are. I mean, and now as we, sit here, Star Wars is just crossing what I think it's right near 2 billion worldwide.
Something like that. Yeah.
And I mean, it's sort of like those are the ones that are becoming the blockbusters. I mean, Hateful Eight made 50 million at the box office, and now that's some people are saying it bombed already.
Yeah.
It's an interesting time in the Hollywood system, to say the least. If you know what I know in the independent circuit, there's a lot of and mainly I talk to people in the independent circuit on this podcast, but things are a little different.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like things we can take a lot more chances because I mean, granted, obviously we're working with a lot less money, but also because most people are crowdfunding or just taking out of their own pocket, so they have nobody to answer to. I
have actually an interesting theory about Scott Pilgrim versus the World. I think I'm the only person I've heard really advance this, but I really think this might be the case. Because Scott Pilgrim versus the World actually was based on a pre-existing property. It was based on a pretty popular American published manga series by a guy named Brian Lee O'Malley. And it's a series that does have a pretty substantial cult following. My theory is this. I know tons of people who have seen Scott Pilgrim versus the World. I don't know a lot of people that paid to watch it. I think it might be the most demonstrable case we have of a movie that might have been killed at the American box office by illegal downloading and internet piracy. Because I think it was a case of a lot of people who think of entertainment as their right and not their privilege, who decided to download the movie illegally because them seeing it was more important than them rewarding the people who made it for them to see. It's something that that's a topic that I really get on people about pretty hard. A lot of people are surprised that I don't illegally download movies. And I always tell them, when my movies are out there, I don't want people illegally downloading mine. So I'm not going to do the same thing to somebody else. I've lost friends over this topic. I remember lacing into a guy about the Avengers because he'd watched it online. And I said, you're the reason that Hollywood struggles at the box office is because you're doing this. And I basically told him, it's not your right to see the Avengers. It's your privilege to see it if you go and buy a ticket. I'm getting a little fired up. I'm sorry. It's a topic that I'm passionate about. Because
I completely understand, Matt.
Yeah, and it just, I don't like the idea that, and it's interesting that we're talking about Star Wars because if there's ever, a group of fans out there who felt like they were owed something, it might be the Star Wars. I actually a couple of days ago, the Academy Award nominations came out, and I put a joke headline up on Facebook. It was supposed to be breaking news, and it was something like Los Angeles burns as fanboy mobs protesting Star Wars Best Picture snub clash with fanboy mobs celebrating Star Wars Best Picture snub. And it's fanboy culture is a very weird thing. I always say, as far as what I call fanboy movies, which are comic book movies, things like Star Wars, there's basically two fundamental rules of those movies. The fanboys will go and the fanboys will bitch. Those are the only things that you can count on with any of those movies. And Star Wars, I assume you've seen The Force Awakens.
Matt, I actually have not.
I will say this. I don't think it's the best movie of the year, but it might be the best time I had in a movie in 2015. I thought it was just a heck of a lot of fun. I can't think of a better way to describe it. And when you get a movie that does the things you want the franchise to do, and it isn't just spat out of a computer, which you didn't want it to be, and isn't, just, midichlorians and Yippee and Jar Jar Binks, you have to latch on to whatever. So now it's Carrie Fisher looks too old. That's what we're getting. And I understand that there's now an online petition to get George Lucas back to direct episode 9. And it's like, you want to pull people aside and say, it was 10 years ago that he did this. Don't you remember what happened the last time? And it's just, I don't know. Fanboys are hard to please. It's God bless Dan for being willing to write genre material, because genre audiences are very tough. They can be very tough to please. And I will say, I'm not knocking genre audiences, because one thing I've had the pleasure of experiencing in the process of promoting this book is I've gotten to go to a lot of horror events. I've spoken at Monsterpalooza in Burbank. I've done a couple signings at Dark Delicacies, which is a fantastic horror store here in LA. And just from talking to fans, I don't know if there's anybody in the world I like more than horror fans. They are so passionate and they are so informed and they love the genre so much. It is just, they've really embraced me, because I'm kind of, when I started this whole thing out, it took me a while to get used to the fact that I wasn't just a barnacle on the SS Dan O'Bannon, that I wasn't just the thing you had to put up with because Dan's not here to talk about his own book. And the horror community has so embraced this book and so embraced me as an element of this book. And it's just, I'll be eternally grateful, and I will defend horror and its fans to my last breath for that.
I concur. The horror fans are always the ones that come out in droves, and the horror fans also, I was talking with this to a producer because we were talking about, what genre would actually, give the best ROI. And I always say it would be horror.
Oh, sure.
Because, horror fans will go see a B horror movie. Comedy fans won't go see a B comedy, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, horror is one of the only genres out there where the genre is the star of the film in a lot of respects. It's not like, oh, I'm going to see this because Brad Pitt's in it, or I'm going to see this because, Leonardo DiCaprio's in it. They go see it because it's a horror movie. I'd say maybe the only genre like that right now that's a genre has had its ups and downs over the years, but I think is starting to reach a little bit of a new renaissance is Westerns. I see a lot of interesting Westerns, mostly independent Westerns coming out. Like, we have The Hateful Eight, which I thought was interesting, not perfect, but interesting. Bone Tomahawk, which I thought was a terrific movie from last year with Kurt Russell and Richard Jenkins. We had Slow West. There's Jane Got a Gun, which comes out in a few weeks. So it's an interesting time for the genre, but I think there are a lot of people who see them simply because they're Westerns and they like Western movies. And I think the tricky part of that becomes, because people will go just because it's horror, you get a lot of really bad horror movies out there because people just think, oh, well, they'll just go if we throw some gore and some tits at them. But when you have one that's really great, I write a blog called The Movie Zombie, and I write about all kinds of movies. And last year for 2014, my number one film of the year was The Babadook, which is the Australian horror film by Jennifer Kent. And I just think that's a movie that's so working with a small budget and is so inventive and comes up with really powerful and profound things to say. And I will say this, it doesn't always connect. Even ones that connect with a lot of people don't always connect with me. If you look at my blog for 2015, my pick for my least favorite movie of the year was It Follows, which is a movie that I know people really, really loved. And it did not work for me at all. And so it is, if you know the genre well enough, you can pick out the nuances of what people are really doing beyond just this is a horror movie. But yeah, horror. But you do make a very great point about the ROI. I think that's very, very true because the genre itself has a built-in following. And if you're in a star-driven thing, you struggle if you have a star that doesn't have a built-in following. Horror always does.
I actually had on a independent director and his producer on the podcast about maybe 10 or so episodes ago. And when they were done shooting their comedy, he actually, took it around to a lot of these distributors, and they actually said, who's in it? And when he told them, they said, we can't sell this.
Right.
And he said that's the one thing he learned is if you're going to make a comedy, it has to have a name in it in one of the principal roles. Or you could do what, the sort of bait and switch, what some people have done, which is like, there was a movie a couple years ago. Elijah Wood was in it for like 5 minutes, but they put him on the cover, and people would buy it and go, "What the hell is this? He's barely even in the movie."
Yeah, well, that does happen too. I mean, you see a lot of films. We have a theater near where I live here in LA that basically shows a lot of these films that come out direct to video. More or less direct to video, will have a situation in their contracts when they contract with the distributor that they have to get at least 1 week of theatrical play in New York or Los Angeles. And I live near a theater that shows a lot of these sort of contractual obligation screenings. Like if any of you have heard of a horror film called Wolves from a couple years ago, there was a werewolf movie with Jason Momoa in it from Game of Thrones. That was a movie I got to see on the big screen because we got sort of the contractual obligation screening of it. I saw a movie from last year called Super Fast, which was basically the guys that did Meet the Spartans taking on the Fast and Furious franchise, which played for a week, and I went and saw that. It's not good. I don't recommend you seek out Super Fast. But it is an opportunity to get to see some of these things. But that's an excellent point about not being able to sell without a star. Comedy is a fairly star-driven genre. I mean, there's not a lot of people even that can really open a comedy. One of the people that seems to be able to do it just had a movie come out this weekend, which is Kevin Hart, who has Ride Along 2, that just came out. I'd say Melissa McCarthy seems to be somebody right now that maybe has the power to open a comedy. And, we'll see. And I mean, every now and then you get a comedy franchise that really connects. Like obviously the Hangover movies did very well and really connected. And I think the second movie outgrossed the first one even by a substantial margin. But it is tricky. And comedy is also a tricky investment for studios because comedy doesn't travel overseas. Humor is very subjective and it's very cultural. So it's easier to take something like The Avengers, which is all action driven, and make that play overseas than it is to take something that's humor driven, which might not land with a Chinese audience or an Indian audience or an Italian audience.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that too, because I remember a couple years ago, the number one movie in China was an independent Chinese movie called Lost in Thailand. Yep. And it was literally about 3 Chinese businessmen who get lost in Thailand. The title may have given that away, but but they get lost in Thailand. And honestly, there was talk of actually showing it here in America, and I don't think they ever did it because I think one of the reasons was they were afraid that American audiences weren't going to get it because it was, a Chinese comedy.
Yeah, and that's very understandable. I mean, a lot of times if you look at box office figures for different nations around the world, you'll see films showing up in their top 10s of the year that do not even play in the United States. And I think people do forget that. A lot of times when we get foreign films, because people always say, well, why are foreign films so much better than what we get in America? That's because we're only getting the best foreign films. They're not bringing over the popcorn movies and the studio comedies and things like that because they figure there's no audience for them. And every country has its own infrastructure of stars and directors. India has, which also this theater near me that shows these contractual obligations, shows a lot of Indian films as well. They show a lot of Bollywood movies. And they have one of the biggest and most intricate star systems in the world. Their movies are very star-driven in India. And actually, every now and then, we do see an Indian star show up in an American movie. There's a film showing at that theater right now starring an Indian actor named Amitabh Bachchan, who some people might remember from the Leonardo DiCaprio Great Gatsby that came out a few years ago. He played Meyer Wolfsheim in that movie. And you have people like Aishwarya Rai and Irfan Khan, who was in Jurassic World last year, who's one of the biggest movie stars in India. And it is interesting to see that, we sort of think those things are unique to America, but they're really not. And our movies that travel overseas are these movies that are, I have a friend who's a film journalist, as he puts it, big gunfights and stuff gonna explode. Like obviously, one of the biggest movies in China of all time now is Transformers: Age of Extinction, which is a movie that was perceived to have somewhat underperformed here in the States, but the perception is it's gonna get a sequel because it grossed something like $1 billion in China. So they made crazy money overseas.
I do remember that Transformers movie when it came out, and I actually didn't see it. I just remember there was an image where it was like a giant Transformer samurai, mm-hmm. and I was like, I wonder if they know that's Japanese. I'm not going to say. I was like, you know what? Maybe somebody will tell them. Who knows? But I do remember they actually shot scenes specifically in China for Chinese audiences. And I remember that was the big hook that they were using for this because I know that, and also I think they were trying to finagle getting that Chinese film tax credit.
Yeah. And
because you have to shoot 60% or so of the movie over there, and it also has to show China in a good light. But if you do those two things, like that's what gives you the pass for their film tax credit. I don't know if they actually made it or not, but yeah, I do remember that Transformers. What was that 4?
Yeah,
Transformers
4. Yeah, and the whole thing is movies have been doing that sort of thing for years. If you remember a film from 1995 called Johnny Mnemonic with Keanu Reeves, which is it's a terrible movie. But if you remember, if you see the American version of that movie, there's real brief little bits with Dolph Lundgren playing a character, and also real little bits with Takeshi Kitano, the Yakuza film star. Those films, if you saw them in Europe, you would have seen a lot more Dolph Lundgren because they shot special scenes for the European market with more of him because he's a bigger name in Europe. Same thing with Takeshi Kitano. There's a lot more scenes of him in the Asian version, specifically in the Japanese version, because he's a huge movie star in Japan. So they shot extra scenes, including his character. So there are these senses where they do tailor films to sort of cater to different parts of the world, which, I mean, to be fair, that considering how much movies cost, that's not the least sensible thing they could possibly be doing.
Yeah, and one thing from Johnny Mnemonic that I always remember is the cyborg Jesus.
That's the Dolph Lundgren character, unless I'm mistaken. I think. Maybe I'm wrong. But I barely remember anything about it. I remember wanting to walk out of it. That's all I remember about Johnny Mnemonic. Is sitting there going, Jesus, it's 45 minutes into this? How much longer is this? I will say, though, I'm very proud. I've never walked out of a movie in the theater in my life. I've come very close a couple of times, but every movie I've seen in the theater, I've stayed through to the sometimes frightfully bitter end.
Yeah, I concur. Even when there's been some movies where I've just wanted to walk out, but I said, you know what? I'm just going to power through it. And that way, at least I can say, okay, I stayed through the whole thing. I know it was a bad movie. And
right.
It's maybe a lesson learned, right?
Well, here's the whole thing. If you don't stay through the whole thing, you can't say it's a bad movie. You can say it has a bad first hour. You don't know. You know what I mean? Although sometimes you do, because a couple of years ago, I remember going to see, believe it or not, I remember going to see Battlefield Earth. And it's one of only 2 films I've ever seen in the theater because I wanted to see if it was as bad as people were saying it was. And 2 minutes in, I kind of relaxed because I was like, oh, this is going to be terrible. I can absolutely tell. Battlefield Earth is bad almost from the very first shot. And in a weird way, I appreciate that kind of integrity because there's nothing worse than a movie that starts out and has a good first 20 minutes or a good half hour and then slowly but surely flies off of the rails and stops working. And Battlefield Earth had the respect for its audience to give them a consistently terrible time the entire way through.
I actually had the screenwriter Corey Mandel on the podcast.
Oh, very good.
Of Battle, and I had to bring it up. I mean, and I just wanted to ask him, because he actually is a very good screenwriting teacher.
Sure.
And he said, Dave, this is what happened. He said, I swear to God, the draft that I turned in to John Travolta was completely different than what you see on the screen.
Yeah, that's the least surprising thing I've ever heard. Because, honestly, even just the fact that he even got a movie through to a studio, anybody that does that is a talented person. I really do believe that. I just having been in the trenches myself and slugged it out, and I'm a talented writer, and I know how tough it is. So the very fact that Corey Mandel even has his name on a studio movie, even if it's Battlefield Earth, is a testament to what he can do.
He goes into length about, just, going through the writing process. I mean, and you're absolutely right, Matt, because he is a talented writer. He certainly knows, the whole process of screenwriting, not in a very simple way, but I mean, in depth, you know what I mean? Like just going through the sort of the atoms, as I like to call it, the atoms of screenwriting, where you get really, really down deep into it. And, that's one of the things he always says, though, is Matt, is he actually sold a project to Ridley Scott, but yet this is the one that gets made, after Battlefield Earth.
Yeah, sometimes you never know. It's good that you bring up the point about sort of really getting down deep, because one of the things that is interesting, I think, about Dan's book, and you've read it, so you know some of this, is Dan is very willing to admit that there's certain things he's basically not going to address in the book. For one thing, he does not cover dialogue writing really at all. There's a general school of thought that Dan subscribes to, which is the idea that dialogue is not really something that he feels can be taught. It's something that has to come out sort of more innately. It's a question of being a good listener and having generally strong language skills. Because I know when I do my own dialogue, and if I may toot my own horn slightly, I do think in my own work, dialogue is a strength of mine. A lot of it comes from just being a good listener. And also when I write, if there are people listening who are screenwriters, if you're not already doing this, you need to be reading your dialogue out loud to yourself when you're writing it. Because you're not writing words that have to live on a page. You're writing lines that actors have to be able to say. And if it's garbled or the message is unclear or you trip over it saying it, chances are an actor is going to do the same thing. And also sometimes you can surprise yourself with certain phrasings and ways of putting things that will come out. Sometimes I get to the point where I'm just literally transcribing as I'm talking and just writing down things that are basically extemporizing out of my mind when I'm writing my dialogue. And Dan even basically says in the book, if you remember, he says, I'm not here to teach you how to write well. What I'm here to do is to teach you how to put together a screenplay with a structure that holds up. He always says, I wasn't – the great example he uses is he talks about helping Ron Chissette on a movie he was producing called Phobia, which was a movie that ended up being directed by John Huston in the early 80s. And he thought it was a script that was not very good, but he basically sort of reworked the structure of it. And the way Dan described it is he said, I was able to use this structural system I designed to transform the movie from a Sal's ear that I didn't want to watch into a Sal's ear I did want to watch. And that's simply by making the structure of the story hold up. So there was a solid through line from beginning to end. So that's something that Dan's book can help you do. It can, at least if your script is still problematic after working with Dan's system, the structure is not going to be one of the things you'll need to worry about.
Yeah, and the book does cover it does cover every structure you can think of.
Yeah.
Because it starts off. I mean, we're starting, for those of you who haven't read the book yet. I mean, it starts off with Aristotle's Poetics.
Yeah.
And that's as far back as we can go, right, man? I mean,
and not when you're talking story, that's as far back as it goes, basically, as far as dramatic storytelling. But yeah, we addressed Lajos Egri, we addressed Sid Field, Robert McKee. We didn't get too much into Blake Snyder, who's kind of like the big hot screenwriter now, the author of Save the Cat, late author of Save the Cat. The main reason we didn't delve into that was simply this: Save the Cat is a Michael Wiese Productions book, as is Dan O'Bannon's Guide to Screenplay Structure. And we didn't want to risk, frankly, we didn't want to risk cutting into a fellow author in the imprint's readership. We thought that would be somewhat unfair. I guess we didn't have the same reservations about cutting into Sid Field or Robert McKee's readership. God bless both their souls. But, fortunately, I do think that I think that the reason that Dan included some of that background is he wanted to give you a sense that this storytelling system is fresh, but it also exists on a continuity with the way stories have sort of been set up and structured since the beginning of time. And I think that it's an interesting thing. We talk about movies that are sort of done in real time. Like we touch on High Noon. We touch on The Setup, which is a boxing film from the 40s that Dan and I watched together. You don't see that done as much nowadays, but I notice you see a lot more of these sort of one-take scenes and things like that are playing around with that idea in a small way. And for example, last night I just saw 13 Hours, which is the new, speaking of Michael Bay, it's the new Michael Bay movie about the Benghazi attack. And that movie deals with a very compressed frame of time. It's right there in the title. And I think that they work actually within that time frame pretty well and give you a sense of kind of how things are going to play out within that time frame. And that's Aristotle's unity of time, place, and action. Actually comes off fairly well, believe it or not, in the new Michael Bay movie.
I saw my Twitter timeline. Somebody actually said Michael Bay has succeeded in making a better Middle Eastern war movie than Clint Eastwood.
Yeah, and Dave, that was me. I said
that was you. All right, yeah.
I do. I wasn't. I think it's. I'm not going to get into a lot because it's a relatively new movie. But I do think that the movie's got some nuances to it and some thoughtfulness and some complexity that I really was not expecting to see in a movie that ends with the words directed by Michael Bay. And in his defense, I think he helps to shepherd some of that along. I think he gets good, effective, low-key performances out of his cast. I think John Krasinski finally shakes off the mantle of Jim Halpert firmly with this performance and does a really great job. He's working with a 2-time Oscar-winning cinematographer, Dion Beebe, shooting digitally. Fully digital for the first time in a Michael Bay movie. And I think that it works. I think it's going to be tough going for people because it's not an easy story. It's not a story with a happy ending. But I think that if people are willing to give it a chance, I think they'll get something out of it.
I'll definitely check that out. And a lot of the war movies that were coming out, I think, some people started to get kind of burned out by them because I know I was getting burned out. I still saw American Sniper.
Yeah.
I still saw Lone Survivor. But, some of the other movies that came out, eventually I think people just got a little too burned out by them. So maybe, but I will check out the Michael Bay. It's 13 hours, right?
13 hours, yeah. It just came out yesterday.
Yeah, I will make sure to check that out. And, but, I wonder too, if there ever will be a stop of all the Iraq war movies. And, most of them are about Iraq. I don't think there's any that have been about Afghanistan.
Well, Benghazi technically was in Libya. So this is actually a different area of the world. But, it kind of all falls under that umbrella of sort of, quote, conflict in the Middle East. And I guess one of the things that's tricky is that we live in a world where people don't know the nuances of the differences between Iraq, between Libya, between Afghanistan, that they look over there and they just see it as one thing. They see, oh, that's Arabs. Get them. Get the Arabs. And I think the movie addresses the fact, one of the characters actually says at one point, it drives us crazy. We can't tell who's good and who's bad. And it's this idea of this sort of, I'm getting into political stuff that probably is beyond the purview of this show. But it's this idea of this sort of toxic mutual mistrust on both sides in that region of the world that sort of affects what's going on. I think that's something that the movie gets out very elegantly and without a whole lot of fuss and muss about it. I think it's inherent to the material, and I think it carries across pretty well.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that was, I made a complete gaffe there. But
that's
but,
fine. You and probably most of the people that want to be president later this year. So that's fine.
Well, Matt, I'm actually announcing my candidacy right now for president of the United States. I'm not old enough, but be damned, I'm going to run.
Listen, if the evidence is any indication I've seen so far, we could certainly do a lot worse.
Well, thank you very much, man. I appreciate that.
No problem.
Matt, we're starting to run out of time, and there's more questions I want to ask you, but I'll have to have you back sometime if you're interested ever in coming back.
Absolutely.
So one of the final questions I want to ask you is, what is the one thing? I know this is going to be a trick question, but what is the one thing, the biggest thing that you took away from working with Dan O'Bannon?
That's a great question, and I know exactly what the answer is. And you sort of alluded to it earlier with something that you said. When you talked about one of the things that was great about Dan is that he was able to cover a lot of different types of genres. He did action films, he did humorous films, he did horror, he did science fiction. And I think the reason for that is because Dan, and this is something I took away from him, Dan never thought of himself as a genre writer. He thought of himself, he always said, I'm a storyteller. A lot of my stories just happen to involve monsters and things from outer space. And he always privileged the story over the genre in which the story was being told. And the thing that I took from that and the message he gave me was, regardless of what type of film you're trying to create, you owe it to yourself, to your muse, and to your audience to create the best whatever that is that you can. If you're making a $10,000 camcorder shot creature feature that you're shooting in a basement on the weekends, you owe it to your audience and you to make the best $10,000 camcorder shot movie that you're shooting on weekends, creature feature in your basement, that you possibly can muster out of your spirit. And I've always tried to keep that in mind, and I've always tried to give my all and my best to whatever I'm writing. And I've written a lot of different genre stuff as well. I mean, I'm looking right now at a wall that's got some screenplay awards I've won at festivals, and I've got an award for a science fiction movie, an award for a horror movie, and an award for an action thriller. And one of the bigger projects I worked on a couple years ago was an adaptation of a comic strip, sort of in the mold of an Alvin and the Chipmunks kind of a movie. And I gave my best to that too. And that was a job I got based on a comedy script that I'd written and submitted to them as a writing sample that they liked. So whatever you're writing, you just owe it to yourself to not talk down to your audience, to give it your all, to give it your best, and to put your best self forward all the time, because nobody else is going to do that for you. That's the main thing that I took from Dan, and one of the main things I hope people take if they read this book.
That is an excellent thing to take away from Dan. Dan loved movies. It was evident in his writing. It was, evident, I mean, even in your story about him having the broadswords on the wall.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure that was an ode towards, the Chinese martial arts, because, just everything about Dan was fun. And from the interviews I've seen with him, it was all, he just loved life and he loved telling these stories. And, that is, even in the book, even when you're reading that book, you can just tell that it comes from a place where this is what he was put on earth to do, and there's no other question about that.
When I read parts of the book, I hear it in my mind in Dan's voice. And I think that if you read that book, you're getting Dan. And I think that's a very important thing, to keep that voice alive as well.
And the one thing that I'm glad his wife actually agreed to be put in there was the one chapter that Dan was going to leave out.
Oh, yeah.
And then she insisted. Then she actually said, you know what? Dan is no longer with us. I'm just going to put the chapter in.
Yeah, we could have done a whole other hour just on that issue. It's a section on a subject called hedonic adaptation. If you read the book, it's a psychological understanding that was developed in the 1970s by a group of psychologists. And it applies very strongly to the way effective on-screen stories are told. So it's a section that's definitely going to teach you a lot in terms of what your movies can do to your audience. And it's really, really interesting to consider.
Yeah, again, Matt, anytime you want to come back on, I'd love to have you, because I can tell you, you're the type of guy I could talk to for hours about movies and stuff like that.
This was a pleasure. I'd be happy to come back.
Like, have you ever seen the movie Killdozer?
I have not, but I'll get on that. That'll be my homework for next time.
What I like to do is I like to get 3 movies that are similar and put them together. And I always have like a killer vehicle trio.
Okay.
And it's usually Killdozer, The Car, and maximum overdrive.
Nice. Very good.
It's not, if the Car is actually my favorite haunted car movie ever.
Oh, interesting.
It's even more than Christine. I don't know if you've ever seen The Car, but.
I have. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, excellent. But yeah, again, Matt, it's a pleasure having you on. And Matt, where can people find you at online?
Well, I'm on Facebook. You can find me as Matt R Lohr. I'm also, there's a page for Dan O'Bannon's Guide to Screenplay Structure. Just search for the title of the book. I'm also on Twitter. I have 2 Twitter feeds. I'm at The Movie Zombie and at Dan O'Bannon Book. And the Movie Zombie handle is my blog, which is themoviezombie.blogspot.com, where I comment on contemporary and classic cinema of all types.
Excellent. And everyone, I will link to all of that in the show notes as well. And everyone, as always, DaveBullis.com. Twitter, it's at Dave_Bullis. Matt Lohr, Matt R Lohr, I want to say thank you. Thank you very much for coming on.
It was a real treat, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. And again, we'll be in touch soon for you to come back on. And and I look forward to hearing what you think about Killdozer.
Sounds good.
Take care, my friend.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Find Dave at davebullis.com. Please make sure to subscribe and share the podcast.